She was 20 years old, and she had just been kicked out. Not with shouting, not with a fight. Just a duffel bag set on the front porch of the small white shingled house on Walnut Street, and a key she was asked to leave under the doormat. The November wind came down off the river that night, carrying the smell of wet leaves and diesel smoke from the barges moving slow through the darkness somewhere out on the Ohio. Willa Jessup stood on the porch of the only home she had known for 6 years and read the note that had been tucked into the top of her duffel bag by hands that had once brushed her hair at the kitchen table every morning before school. The note said, "Willa, I love you, child. Grover needs the house to be his house, and I need to make this marriage work, or I will be alone again. The key is under the doormat. Please put it back when you go. I am sorry. Please understand. Aunt Coralie." Willa read it twice. She tried the front door. It was locked, the deadbolt thrown from the inside. She walked around to the back of the house through the narrow side yard where she had played as a child and where the old clothesline still hung between two rusted metal poles. She tried the back door. Locked. She stood there for a long moment in the cold dark of the backyard, looking up at the windows of the house. The bedroom window on the second floor where she had slept for 6 years was dark. The kitchen window showed a faint yellow light from somewhere deeper in the house. She could see the shape of the old icebox through the glass, and the corner of the kitchen table where she had eaten breakfast every morning since she was 14 years old. She did not knock. She did not call out. She walked back around to the front porch and picked up her duffel bag. The canvas was cold and slightly damp from the November air. She reached into the chest pocket of her faded indigo denim chore coat and touched the brass pilot's whistle that hung there on its worn yellow lanyard. The metal was cold against her fingers. It was always cold in the morning and warm by afternoon from pressing against her ribs all day. She had carried that whistle in her chest pocket for 6 years. She did not know how to be in the world without it. Willa Jessup took the house key from under the doormat and placed it back exactly where the note had asked her to place it. Then she shouldered her duffel bag and walked down the 3 wooden steps of the porch and out onto Walnut Street. She did not cry. Her grandfather, Harlan Jessup, had told her father a long time ago that a river person learns to keep her water inside her own banks. Her father had told her the same thing when she was 9 years old, standing beside him at her mother's funeral. She had remembered it ever since. The walk from Walnut Street to the Western Union office and laundromat on the riverside of Mound City was 11 blocks. Willa walked it in the cold November dark with her duffel bag over her shoulder and the brass whistle pressing against her ribs, and she did not let herself think about anything except the next step, and the next step and the next step after that. The Western Union office was closed for the night, but the light was still on in the back room behind the dryers. Willa could see it through the front window. She knocked on the glass door 3 times and waited. Pearl Dunaway appeared from the back room. She was 68 years old with iron gray hair pulled back in a bun and a heavy hand-knitted cardigan over a flannel shirt. And she moved with the slow, careful steps of a woman who had been on her feet since 5 in the morning. She took one look at Willa's face through the glass and unlocked the door without saying a word. She did not ask any questions. She turned the open sign to closed and led Willa to the folding table in the back room behind the row of industrial dryers. The machines were still warm from the last load of the day, and the air smelled like clean cotton and fabric softener, and the faint mineral undertone of river water that never quite washed out of anything in a town built on the banks of the Ohio. Pearl brought her a glass of sweet tea from the small refrigerator under the counter. She brought her a bowl of red-eye gravy and biscuits that she had packed from her own kitchen for her supper. She sat across from Willa at the folding table and watched her eat without saying anything. When Willa was finished eating, Pearl said, "There is a folding cot in the storage room behind the dryers. It is yours for as long as you need it. Tomorrow we will figure out what comes next." That was all she said. Willa slept on the cot in the storage room that night with her duffel bag at her feet and the hum of the dryers coming through the wall behind her head. The sound was low and constant and rhythmic. It was the closest thing to a riverboat engine she had heard since her father had died on the water 6 years before. She slept better in that small storage room than she had slept in any room of her life since then. She kept the brass whistle in the chest pocket of her chore coat, even when she slept. The weight of it against her ribs was a thing that had been there for 6 years, and she did not know how to close her eyes without it. But even as she lay there in the dark, listening to the dryers hum through the wall, Willa knew that she could not stay forever. Pearl Dunaway was 68 years old. The laundromat was getting harder for her to run alone, and Willa did not want to become a person who needed somebody else to carry her. That was a phrase her father had used once, about a man in their old neighborhood. Willa had remembered it ever since, without being sure why. But she understood it now. She understood it perfectly. She would find somewhere of her own to go. She just did not know where yet. To understand why Willa Jessup was lying on a folding cot in a storage room in Mound City, Illinois on that cold November night with nothing to her name but a duffel bag and a brass whistle and $1,043 in a green metal coffee tin, you have to understand where she came from. You have to understand the river. The Jessup family had been moving toward the water for 3 generations. They were river people the way some families are farming people or railroad people or mining people. The Ohio River was not just a thing they lived beside. It was a thing that lived inside them. It was the first sound Willa heard in the morning when she was a child. Growing up in a small house 2 streets back from the water in Mound City, it was the last sound she heard at night. The low diesel rumble of the towboats pushing their barges through the darkness. The deep 2-note horn that carried for miles across the flat river bottoms. Her grandfather, Harlan Jessup, had been a river pilot on the lower Ohio from 1948 until 1979. 31 years standing in the wheelhouse of towboats, guiding them through the locks and the long, quiet reaches and the dangerous bends where the current ran mean and the sandbars shifted with every rise and fall of the water. But Harlan had not started in the wheelhouse. He had spent 13 years as a deckhand and leadsman before he ever touched the controls of a towboat. 13 years learning the river from the deck. 13 years learning the weight of a barge and the pull of the current and the way the water changed color over a sandbar and the names of every bend and crossing from Cairo to Louisville. When Harlan Jessup finally earned his pilot's license in 1961, he walked the 7 blocks home from the federal building in Paducah and put the framed certificate on the kitchen wall above the bread box. It stayed there for the rest of his life. His wife said he looked at it every morning when he poured his first cup of coffee. Harlan kept a brass pilot's whistle on a faded yellow lanyard around his neck. For every one of those 31 years on the river, the whistle was from his first year working boats before he was ever given a wheelhouse. It was the kind of whistle that deckhands used to signal each other across the noise of the engines and the wind. Harlan never used it for signaling after he became a pilot. He just kept it there against his chest, because it reminded him of where he had started. When he retired in 1979, he gave the whistle to his son. His son was named Emmett. Emmett Jessup was Willa's father. Emmett had wanted to become a pilot himself. He had grown up watching his father come home from the river, with stories of the water and the boats and the men who worked them. He had learned to read the surface of the river for sandbars before he was 10 years old. He knew the names of every bend and crossing from Cairo to Louisville by heart, the way some children know the words to songs or the names of baseball players. But the river had changed by the time Emmett was old enough to work it. The big towboat companies were consolidating in the late 70s and early 80s. The old ways of moving up from deckhand to leadsman to pilot were getting harder. The jobs were fewer. The competition was fiercer. The path that Harlan had walked from 1948 to 1961 was not the same path anymore. Emmett took a deckhand job with Ingram Marine Service out of Paducah in 1989. He was 23 years old. He thought it would be the first step toward the wheelhouse the way it had been for his father. He did not know that it would be the only step he ever got. He worked the river for 15 years, pushing barges through the locks and the long, quiet reaches that only towboat men ever see. He came home every 6 weeks for a 5-day shore leave. And when he was home, he taught his daughter everything he knew about the water. Willa was born in 1994, in the same small house in Mound City where her father had been born. Her mother, Opal, was a quiet woman with dark hair and a gentle voice who worked part-time at the county library and who loved her husband and her daughter with a fierce, protective love that she rarely spoke aloud, but that you could see in the way she watched them when they were together. Willa's earliest memories were of the river. She remembered sitting on her father's lap on the front porch of the house on Walnut Street, watching the towboats move past in the distance. She remembered the low sound of the engines and the way the navigation lights looked like moving stars against the dark water. She remembered her father pointing to each boat and telling her the name of it and the name of the pilot if he knew it, and where the boat was probably going and what it was probably carrying. She remembered drawing pictures of towboats at the kitchen table when she was 4 years old. Her father had saved them in a cigar box on top of the icebox. By the time she was 9, the box was full. She remembered walking along the riverbank with her father when she was 7. He showed her how to read the surface of the water for sandbars, the way the current rippled differently over shallow water, the way the color changed from brown to tan where the bottom came up close. He taught her the names of the bends and crossings, the way an old priest might teach a child the stations of the cross, with patience, with reverence, with the understanding that these names were sacred things that connected the present to the past. She remembered her father coming home from the river after 6 weeks away, the way her mother's face changed when she heard his truck pull into the driveway, the way the whole house seemed to breathe again when he walked through the door. And she remembered the morning her mother did not wake up. It was January. Willa was 8 years old. Her mother had been sick for 2 weeks with a cough that would not go away. The doctor had said it was pneumonia. He had given her medicine and told her to rest. She had rested. She had taken the medicine. But the sickness had settled into her lungs like winter settling into the ground, and it had not let go. Willa's father was on the river when it happened. He was 3 days from the end of his hitch somewhere on the lower Ohio, pushing a string of coal barges toward a power plant in Kentucky. He got the message by radio. He left the boat at the next lock and hitched a ride home in the back of a supply truck. By the time he got there, Opal was already gone. Willa remembered standing beside her father at the funeral. She was 8 years old, and she was wearing a black dress that her Aunt Coralie had bought for her the day before because she did not own anything black. The dress was too big. It hung on her like a sack. Her father held her hand through the whole service, and when it was over and they were standing beside the grave, he looked down at her and said, "A river person keeps her water inside her own banks. Do you understand what that means?" Willa said she did. She wasn't sure she did, but she said it anyway. Her father nodded and squeezed her hand, and they walked back to the car together. And they did not talk about her mother again for a long time. After Opal died, Emmett Jessup raised his daughter alone. He had help from his sister-in-law, Coralie. Coralie was the wife of his older brother, Boyd. They lived 2 streets over in a small, white, shingled house with lace curtains and a front porch with a swing. Coralie was a woman in her 50s who had wanted children of her own and never been given any. She took to Willa the way water takes to a low place in the ground. Naturally, completely. Without needing to be asked, Coralie came over every morning before school to make sure Willa was dressed and fed. She brushed Willa's hair at the kitchen table with the patient, careful hands of a woman who had been waiting her whole life to brush a child's hair. She made red-eye gravy on Sunday mornings when Emmett was home from the river, and the 3 of them would sit at the kitchen table together and eat and talk, and for a little while, it almost felt like being a family again. But Emmett was gone more than he was home. 6 weeks on the river, 5 days at home, 6 weeks on the river again. That was the rhythm of their lives for 6 years after Opal died. Willa learned to be alone. She learned to do her homework at the kitchen table by herself and to make her own breakfast in the morning, and to walk herself to school and to come home to an empty house in the afternoon, and to not be afraid of the silence. She learned to watch the river. She would sit on the front porch in the evenings when her father was gone and watch the towboats move past in the distance, and she would imagine him standing in the wheelhouse of one of them. She would imagine him looking back toward Mound City and thinking about her the way she was thinking about him. She learned to carry the brass whistle. Her father had started wearing it around his neck, the same way his father had. When he came home for shore leave, the whistle hung against his chest on its faded yellow lanyard, and Willa could hear it clink softly against his shirt buttons when he bent down to hug her. She loved that sound. She loved everything about those 5 days when he was home. The sound of his voice in the house, the smell of river water and diesel fuel that clung to his clothes even after they had been washed, the way he would sit on the front porch with her in the evenings and point to the boats moving past and tell her stories about the men who worked them and the places they were going. She loved him more than she had words to say. And then one February morning when she was 14 years old, she woke up and he was dead. It happened on the river. A tow line snapped in heavy current near the New Madrid Bend. A barge shifted. Emmett Jessup was on the deck doing the work he had done for 15 years. He was in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and the river took him the way the river had taken men for as long as men had worked it. The Coast Guard report used the words "no fault," Ingram Marine Service, and a black wreath to the funeral, and a check for an amount that did not begin to cover what had been lost. The brass pilot's whistle on the yellow lanyard came to Willa in a small velvet box at the funeral. It had been passed down from Harlan to Emmett. Now it was hers. The last link in a chain that stretched back 3 generations. The last piece of her father that she could hold in her hand. She put it in the chest pocket of her coat that day, and she had carried it there ever since, cold against her ribs in the morning, warm against her ribs by afternoon. She was 14 years old, and she had lost her mother and her father, and the only thing she had left of either of them was a brass whistle and a box of drawings, and the knowledge that a river person keeps her water inside her own banks. After the funeral, Willa went to live with Aunt Coralie and Uncle Boyd. The house on Walnut Street was small, but it was warm. Coralie gave Willa the spare bedroom on the 2nd floor. It had a window that looked out over the backyard, and if you stood on your toes and leaned to the left, you could just see a sliver of the river through the gap between 2 houses. Willa stood at that window every night before she went to sleep. She would look at that sliver of river, and she would think about her father somewhere beneath the water, near the New Madrid Bend, and she would touch the brass whistle in her chest pocket, and she would not cry. She finished her schooling. She graduated from Mound City High School in the spring of her 18th year, with grades that were good enough to get her into college if she had wanted to go. But she did not want to go. She did not know what she wanted. She only knew that the river was still there, and that the sound of the towboat engines in the night still made her feel something that she could not name. She got a job at the Western Union office and laundromat that Pearl Dunaway ran on the river side of town. Pearl was 68 years old. She was the widow of a retired riverboat engineer named Ezra Dunaway, who had known Willa's grandfather Harlan personally back in the towboat days. She ran the Western Union counter and the dryers the way she ran her own life, with strong coffee in a thermos under the counter, with few wasted words, with an unspoken understanding that the people who came through her door were carrying things they did not always want to talk about. Pearl took an interest in Willa, not because she felt sorry for her. Pearl Dunaway did not believe in feeling sorry for people. She believed in giving them work to do and letting them figure themselves out while they did it. She took an interest in Willa because Willa actually wanted to learn. She paid Willa in cash and let her work the closing shift on weekends when the laundromat was empty and the Western Union counter was quiet, and the only sounds were the hum of the dryers and the soft click of the cash register tape. Willa saved every dollar she could from those paychecks. She kept the money in a green metal coffee tin in the back of her closet at Aunt Coralie's house. It was an old Folgers tin that still smelled faintly of grounds, even though she had cleaned it twice. She did not know what she was saving for, but she saved anyway. By the time she was 18, she had $612 in the tin. By the time she was 19, she had $1,043. She kept saving because her grandfather Harlan had taught her father that some things you save without knowing why, and the why finds you later. For 6 years, Willa lived in the small white house on Walnut Street with Aunt Coralie and Uncle Boyd. She worked at the Western Union office. She saved her money. She walked to the river sometimes in the evenings and watched the boats go by and thought about her father and her grandfather and the long line of Jessup men who had worked the water. She did not think about the future very much. The future was a fog bank that she could not see into. She only thought about the next day and the next week, and the weight of the brass whistle in her chest pocket that reminded her where she came from. Then, in the autumn of her 20th year, everything changed. Uncle Boyd died of a stroke on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He was sitting in his chair on the front porch reading the newspaper when it happened. Aunt Coralie found him there an hour later when she came home from the grocery store. The newspaper was still in his lap. The funeral was small. Boyd had been a quiet man who kept to himself. He had worked 30 years at the grain elevator on the south side of town, and he had never asked for anything from anyone. And he had loved his wife Coralie with a steady, patient love that did not need to announce itself. After the funeral, Coralie was alone in the house with Willa. For 3 months they lived together, the way they had lived for the past 6 years. Coralie made breakfast in the morning. Willa went to work at the Western Union office. They ate dinner together in the evenings and watched television and did not talk very much, because neither of them had ever been the kind of person who needed to fill silence with words. Then, in December, Coralie met a man at a church social. His name was Grover Tatum. He was a retired farmer from the next county over. He was 65 years old and he had been widowed for 3 years, and he was looking for a companion to share his remaining time with. Coralie was 63. She had been married to Boyd for 38 years. She had never imagined herself with anyone else. But Boyd was gone and the house was quiet, and Grover Tatum was a decent man who made her laugh for the first time since the funeral. They were married in February. It was a small ceremony at the courthouse. Willa stood beside her aunt and watched her sign the marriage certificate, and she felt something shift in the air around her. Something that she could not name, but that she knew meant change was coming. Grover moved into the house on Walnut Street. He was not a bad man. Willa wanted to make that clear to herself. He was not cruel. He was not mean. He was just the kind of quiet, inflexible man who needed his own household to be his own household. He had lived alone for 3 years after his wife died, and he had gotten used to things being a certain way. His coffee made a certain way. His newspaper folded a certain way. His evenings quiet and undisturbed. Willa tried to stay out of his way. She worked longer hours at the Western Union office. She spent more time at Pearl's after the laundromat closed, helping her count the register and fold the last loads of laundry. She came home late and went to her room early, and tried to make herself small in a house that no longer felt like it had room for her. But Grover had 2 grown daughters from his first marriage. They came around on Sundays. They sat in the living room with their father and their new stepmother, and they looked at Willa the way you might look at a piece of furniture that did not match the rest of the room. They never said anything directly. They did not have to. Willa could feel it in the air. She was an extra mouth at their stepmother's table. She was a complication in a situation that they wanted to be simple. A week before Thanksgiving, Willa came home from a closing shift at Pearl's and found her duffel bag packed and sitting on the front porch. The folding inside the bag was Aunt Coralie's careful work. She had folded everything Willa owned the way she folded her own laundry, with the soft creases of a woman who had been doing housework for 40 years, with the love that she could not say with words pressed into every neat fold and every careful corner. The note was tucked into the top of the bag. Willa read it standing on the porch in the November cold. She read it twice. She tried the doors, both locked. She did not knock. She did not shout. She did not cry. She picked up her duffel bag and touched the brass whistle in her chest pocket and walked the 11 blocks to Pearl's Western Union office in the cold November dusk. A river person keeps her water inside her own banks. That was the only thought in her head as she walked. Keep your water inside your own banks. For 2 months, Willa slept on the folding cot in the storage room behind the dryers at Pearl's laundromat. She worked her shifts at the Western Union counter. She helped Pearl with the heavy work that Pearl was getting too old to do alone. She saved her money in the green metal coffee tin that she now kept under her cot instead of in a closet. She did not feel sorry for herself. She did not have time for that. She was too busy trying to figure out what came next. She looked at apartments in Cairo. They were too expensive. She looked at rented rooms in the rougher parts of Paducah. They made her feel unsafe. She sat in the Greyhound station in Cairo twice during those 2 months. She bought a cup of coffee and watched the buses come and go and tried to imagine which direction she would go if she got on one. She did not know. She only knew that she could not stay in the storage room forever. Pearl was 68. The laundromat was hard work, and Willa did not want to become a person who needed somebody else to carry her. Then one cold January evening, everything changed. Willa was sitting at the folding table in the back of the laundromat with a cup of Pearl's coffee and an old laptop that Pearl had brought from her own house. She was searching the internet without any real purpose. Just looking. Just wondering. Just hoping that something would appear on the screen that might point her toward whatever was supposed to come next. She typed cheapest property, Southern Illinois. She wasn't sure why she typed it. Maybe because she had been thinking about Louisiana. Her grandfather Harlan had talked about Louisiana once, about the bayou country down south of New Orleans where the rivers spread out into 1,000 channels, and the water and the land became the same thing. He had talked about it like it was a dream he had never quite reached, but Louisiana was a long way. Willa did not have the bus fare. Southern Illinois was close enough that she could walk to it if she had to. The search results came up on the screen. The fourth result was a county surplus auction page from a place called Pulaski County. Willa clicked on it. The county was clearing 11 abandoned buildings off its tax rolls before a planned spring demolition. A Grange Hall, a creamery, a one-room schoolhouse, a volunteer fire shed, a net mender's shack, and near the bottom of the list, a building described as former Olmsted Riverboat Landing Office, abandoned 1958, scheduled for burn pile May. The price was $1. Willa stared at the listing for a long moment. Pearl was standing behind her. She had come over to see what Willa was looking at on the screen. She read the listing over Willa's shoulder, and her face changed in a way that Willa had never seen before. Olmsted Pearl said. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. Willa turned to look at her. Your grandfather Harlan used to land there in the 50s, Pearl said. There was an old pilot named Calvin Mosley at the landing office. He took the line for Harlan more than once when the current was running mean. Calvin was the kind of man who put his coffee pot on the stove at 4 in the morning, so it would be ready when the first towboat came in. Nobody asked him to do it. He just did it for 30 years. Willa touched the brass whistle through the front of her chore coat. "Pearl," she said, "I think I'm going to go look at it." Pearl nodded slowly. Her eyes were still on the screen. On the words, "Former Olmsted Riverboat Landing Office. Abandoned 1958. "I think you are too, child," Pearl said. "Take the bus. I will pack you a lunch." The Greyhound from Cairo to Pulaski County took most of a morning. The bus rolled south through the long, flat farmland of the lower Illinois bottoms. The fields were brown for winter. The cottonwood trees were bare against the gray January sky. Willa watched it all through the bus window. She watched the way the land flattened out as they got closer to the river, the way the sky seemed to get bigger, the way the horizon stretched away in every direction like the edge of an ocean. She knew this land. She had never been here before, but she knew it. It was the same land she had grown up on, the same river country, the same brown fields and gray skies and bare trees that she had looked at her whole life from the other side of the water. The final leg of the journey was a county shuttle that ran twice a week. It dropped Willa at a crossroads 3 miles from the township office in a part of southern Illinois, where the road wound down through stands of cottonwood and sycamore toward the Mississippi River bluffs. The air smelled like wet earth and river silt and the sweet, faint smell of cottonwood bark. Willa walked the 3 miles. The duffel bag grew heavy on her shoulder. The brass whistle in her chest pocket pressed cold against her ribs. Her boots made soft sounds on the gravel road. There were no cars, no people. Just the road and the trees and the gray January sky, and somewhere in the distance the sound of a barge horn carrying across the water. The Pulaski County Township office was a small frame building beside a closed feed store on a single street with 5 other buildings on it. Inside, a woman in her 50s sat behind a counter with a mug of coffee and a stack of property records. She had silver-streaked hair pulled back in a clip and a heavy hand-knitted cardigan over a flannel shirt. A small brass nameplate on the counter said, "Doreen Fitch, Township Clerk." The woman looked up when Willa walked in. She looked at the duffel bag. She looked at Willa's face. She looked at the worn indigo chore coat and the boots that had walked 3 miles on a gravel road. "You are here about the landing office," Doreen said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You know it has been closed since '58. The dock fell into the river years ago. No power, no water that anybody has tested. The county is planning to burn it the first week of May." "Yes, ma'am." Doreen Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were the color of river water in winter, gray and deep and patient. "Honey," she said, "are you sure that is not a building you can just move into? No electric, no road that has been graded in 20 years. You would be alone out there in a way most folks do not really know what alone is." Willa looked back at her. "Ma'am," she said, "I know what I'm looking at. I know it is going to be hard. But I have been told I need to make my own decisions, and this is the one I am making." The words came out steady, clear. She did not know where they came from, but they felt true when she said them. Doreen Fitch looked at her for another long moment. Something passed across her face. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. Or the memory of a time when she herself had stood in front of someone and said words that felt truer than she knew how to explain. She pulled a deed book from a shelf behind her and turned to a page that had been waiting for years. "Sign here," she said. "And here. And here." Willa signed her name in the careful, slanted handwriting that her father had taught her. Willa Jessup. The same way she had signed it on her high school diploma. The same way she had signed it on her employee paperwork at the Western Union office. The same way she would sign it for the rest of her life. Doreen took the dollar bill. She folded it once. She tucked it into a metal cash box that sat on the shelf behind her. She picked up a brass stamp and pressed it down onto the deed with a soft, flat sound that seemed to echo in the small, quiet office. "Welcome to Pulaski County," she said. Her voice was softer than before. "Take care of yourself out there." Willa Jessup walked out of the township office with a deed in her pocket and a duffel bag over her shoulder, and a brass whistle pressing against her ribs. She was 20 years old. She had $1 to her name, and she had just spent it. She had bought a building that had been closed since 1958 and was scheduled to be burned in May. But as she walked out into the cold January afternoon and looked toward the river bluffs in the distance, she felt something settle in her chest. Something she had not felt since her father died on the water 6 years before. She felt like she was walking towards something instead of away from something. She did not know what was waiting for her in that old landing office on the bluffs above the Mississippi. She did not know about the small wooden cabinet behind the pilot's desk. She did not know about the sealed compartment that had not been touched in over 65 years. She did not know that inside that compartment was something that would change her life forever. All she knew was that the river was calling her the way it had called her grandfather and her father before her, and she was finally ready to answer. The landing office stood at the top of a low bluff above the Brown River, in a small clearing where a sand and gravel road sloped down toward the water. Doreen's husband Cleon drove Willa out in a green pickup truck that rattled over every rut and stone in the road. He was a quiet man in his 60s, with hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime gripping tools and steering wheels. He did not ask Willa any questions during the drive. He just pointed out landmarks when they passed them. The old grain silo that had been struck by lightning in 1987. The stand of sycamores where the county used to hold 4th of July picnics before the war. The place where the road curved and you could see the river for the first time through a gap in the trees. When they came around the final bend and the landing office appeared in the clearing ahead, Cleon slowed the truck to a stop and let Willa look. The building was a single story of dark red weathered cedar planks. 65 years of river weather had faded the wood to the color of dried tobacco. A wide overhanging eave ran the length of the river-facing side, casting a deep shadow over the front porch. The peaked shingle roof had shingles missing in patches near the back where the rain had gotten in over the decades. 2 tall windows on the riverside had old wooden shutters hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Above the door, a faded sign had once said, "Olmsted Landing, Ohio River Lines," but now showed only the ghost of the lettering. The paint had peeled away year by year, until only the shadow of the words remained pressed into the wood like a memory that refused to disappear completely. Below the bluff, the old wooden dock had collapsed into the river years ago. Only a few green-weeded pilings still rose out of the brown water at low tide. They stood there like the bones of something that had died a long time ago and been picked clean by the current. Cleon pulled the truck up to the edge of the clearing and stopped. "Doreen said she would have my hide if I did not get you settled in," he said. There is a back room with a cot if you have got a sleeping bag. We will come check on you in 2 days." He handed Willa a key. It was an old brass key with a long shaft and a simple cut, the kind of key that had not been made in 50 years. Willa took it. Cleon looked at her for a moment. His eyes were kind. Worried, maybe. But kind. "You sure about this?" he said. It was not really a question. He already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Willa said. Cleon nodded slowly. Then he put the truck in reverse and backed out of the clearing and drove away down the gravel road. The sound of the engine faded into the distance until there was nothing left but silence. Willa stood alone in the clearing with her duffel bag at her feet and the key in her hand. The silence was enormous. It was not the silence of a house at night when everyone is asleep. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting. A silence that had depth to it, that had weight, that seemed to press against her ears and her skin and the inside of her chest. She could hear the river below the bluff, the soft, constant whisper of water moving against the bank, the occasional slap of a wave against the old pilings. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, and another crow answered. And then the silence came back even deeper than before. The light was the color of late winter copper. A cold breeze came up the bluff from the river, carrying the smell of mud and dead leaves and the mineral undertone of water that had traveled 1,000 miles to reach this place. Willa stood there and just looked. She looked at the faded cedar planks and the crooked shutters and the ghost of the sign above the door. She looked at the collapsed dock below, and the brown river beyond, and the far bank where the trees were bare against the gray sky. She looked at the clearing around her, with its winter grass, pressed flat by months of frost, and its gravel road disappearing into the trees. She had not known this place existed 2 weeks ago. She had not known that her grandfather Harlan had landed here 17 times in 1956 and 1957. She had not known that a man named Calvin Mosley had made coffee on a pot-bellied stove at 4 in the morning for 30 years for men he was not required to serve. But standing here now in the cold January afternoon, she felt something that she could not explain. It was like the feeling of a key turning in a lock that you did not know was there until the moment the key found it. Somewhere in the distance, a barge horn sounded. Long, low. 2 notes that carried impossibly far in the cold January air. Willa picked up her duffel bag and walked toward the landing office. The porch boards creaked under her boots. The wood was gray with age, but solid. It held her weight without complaint. She stopped at the door and looked at the old brass lock. It was covered with a patina of green corrosion, but when she put the key in, it turned smoothly. The mechanism inside was still sound after all these years, built to last by men who understood that some things needed to outlive the people who made them. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a single long room. The floor was wide pine planks, scuffed silver gray by decades of boots and time. The walls were dark wainscoting painted a faded river green that had once been bright, but had mellowed over the years into something softer, something that looked like it had grown there instead of being applied by human hands. A black pot-bellied cast-iron stove stood in the corner near the door. It was cold. It had been cold for 65 years, but it was still there, still waiting. The stovepipe rose up through the ceiling, and Willa could see where it had been sealed with tin flashing that had turned the color of old pewter. At the far end of the room, set against the river-facing wall under the two tall windows, was the pilot's desk. Willa walked toward it slowly. Her boots made a soft, hollow sound on the wide pine floor. Each step seemed to echo in the empty room. The sound bounced off the walls and the ceiling and came back to her, changed, deeper, more resonant, like the room was listening to her footsteps and answering them with footsteps of its own. The pilot's desk was a heavy oak roll top with a high stool behind it. The wood was dark with age and oil. The brass hardware had turned green, but it was still solid, still functional. Willa reached out and touched the roll top with her fingertips. The wood was cold and smooth. It felt like touching something that had been sleeping for a long time. She rolled the top back. It moved smoothly on its tracks. No sticking, no resistance. Just the quiet rumble of wooden slats sliding over wooden guides the way they had been designed to do by craftsmen who took pride in their work. Inside the desk were the remnants of a life, old fare cards in a wooden tray, a chipped ceramic inkwell with dried ink crusted black at the bottom, a brass blotter with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, a wooden pencil cup with 3 pencils still standing in it, as if Calvin Mosley had set them there after his last shift, and walked out the door and never come back. Willa stood there looking at these things, these small, ordinary things that had belonged to a man she had never met, a man who had known her grandfather, a man who had taken the line for the Mabel Tucker more than once when the current was running mean. She turned to look at the wall behind the desk. There was a small wooden cabinet mounted on the wall. It had 2 doors with a brass hasp holding them shut. The hasp was secured by a tiny padlock the size of a walnut. The lock was corroded green with age. Willa reached out and touched the lock. It came apart in her fingers at the first pull. The rust fell away in soft red flakes that drifted down to the floor like dried leaves. The mechanism inside had seized up years ago. Decades ago. It had been waiting for someone to come and open it, and now it gave way as easily as a held breath finally released. Willa opened the cabinet doors. Inside the cabinet were 3 things. They sat on a single oak shelf that had been built into the back of the cabinet. The shelf was narrow, just wide enough to hold what it held. It had been put there on purpose, designed for these 3 things and these 3 things alone. The first thing was a heavy leather-bound book, a river pilot's logbook with a cover stamped in faded gold lettering that said, Olmsted Landing Daily Log, 1956. The second thing was a small tin box about the size of a paperback novel. It was the kind of tin that had been used for tobacco or candy in the old days. The lid was pressed on tight, and the sides were spotted with rust, but it was still sealed. The third thing was tucked behind the logbook against the back of the cabinet. A wax-sealed envelope. The wax was dark red, almost brown. It had been pressed with some kind of seal, but the impression had blurred over the years until you could not tell what it had been. Willa lifted them out one at a time. The logbook was heavy in her hands. The leather was dry and cracked, but still holding together. The pages inside made a soft rustling sound when she moved it. The tin box was lighter than she expected. Something shifted inside when she tilted it. Something that sounded like paper. The envelope was stiff and brittle. The wax seal had dried out over the decades. It would crack and fall away if she touched it too hard. She carried all three down to the floor in front of the cold, pot-bellied stove. The light from the tall river windows was strongest there. It came in at a low angle and fell across the wide pine boards in long golden rectangles that seemed to glow against the gray wood. Willa sat down cross-legged with the three objects in front of her. She opened the logbook first. The pages were thin paper. The ink had faded from black to brown over the years. The entries were written in a small, careful slant. Each page recorded the towboat traffic for one day, the names of the boats, the names of the pilots, the cargo they carried, the time of arrival, the time of departure, the river stage in feet, the weather. The handwriting was precise and consistent. The same hand had written every entry. The same man had sat at that desk under those tall windows day after day for years, recording the passage of every boat that came through Olmsted. Willa turned the pages slowly. She turned them the way you turn the pages of a book that has been waiting for you. With reverence, with patience, with the understanding that what you are holding is not just paper and ink, but the record of something real, something that happened, something that mattered. About a third of the way through the logbook, she found what she was looking for. The entry was dated May 15th, 1956. It said, Harlan Jessup Towboat, Mabel Tucker cargo coal arrived 4:18 a.m. departed 6:42 a.m. river stage 18.6 feet weather light fog. Willa read the entry 3 times. Her grandfather had landed at this very office on a foggy morning in May of 1956. He had climbed the steps of this porch and walked through that door and stood at that desk and signed a fare card, while Calvin Mosley poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the pot-bellied stove. That stove, the one that was 6 feet away from where she was sitting right now. She kept turning pages. Harlan Jessup appeared in the logbook 17 times between the spring of 1956 and the autumn of 1957. Some of the entries had small notes written in the margin. Not official notes. Personal notes. The kind of notes a man writes for himself to remember something. One said Harlan brought a sack of pecans for the office. Another said Harlan's first crossing of the season. Looked tired. Willa touched the words with her fingertips. The ink was so old that it felt like part of the paper, like it had sunk in and become one with the fibers. Her grandfather had brought pecans for this office. Calvin Mosley had noticed that he looked tired after his first crossing of the season. These two men had known each other, had shared coffee in the early morning dark, had talked about the river and the boats and the weather and all the small things that men talk about when they work the same water. Willa set the logbook down gently on the floor beside her. She picked up the wax-sealed envelope. The seal cracked and fell away when she slid her finger under the flap. Pieces of dark red wax scattered across the pine floor like drops of dried blood. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, folded twice. The letter was written in the same careful slant as the logbook entries. The same hand, the same brown ink faded by age. It said, "To whoever finds this, my name is Calvin Mosley. I have been the landing office pilot at Olmsted on the lower Ohio River. From 1932 until today, the 3rd of November, 1958. The landing is being closed at the end of this week. The new lock and dam at Smithland is finishing construction, and the towboat companies are consolidating their stops further down the river. There will be no more boats coming into Olmsted after Friday. I am 66 years old, and I have no children. My wife, Lottie, passed in the influenza spring of 1949. I have spent 26 years in this small office watching towboats come up out of the fog at 4 in the morning and go back out into it before sunrise. And I have made a pot of coffee on that pot-bellied stove every day of those 26 years for the men who work boats, even though it was not part of my duties. I considered it my duty anyway. Coffee is a small kindness, and a small kindness on a cold morning is sometimes the difference between a good shift and a hard one. I have saved a portion of every paycheck I ever drew in the tin box hidden in this cabinet, where my father-in-law built a secret shelf in 1932, because he did not trust banks after the failure of the Cairo Trust. I do not need the money any longer. I am leaving it for whoever comes through this door next. The whistle is from my own first year on the river before I was ever given a wheelhouse. The logbook is the daily record of every boat that came through Olmsted in the last 2 years. Harlan Jessup is in there. So are 100 other men whose hands I shook and whose coffee I poured. If you are reading this letter, you came into this office after I am gone, maybe long after. I want you to know that a landing office is not just a building. A landing office is a room that remembers every boat that ever tied up to its dock, and every pilot who ever climbed its steps in the cold dark before sunrise to drink a cup of bad coffee and sign a fare card and go back out into the river. The river forgets nothing. The room does not either. Calvin Mosley, landing pilot. Olmsted Landing, November 3rd, 1958. Willa read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully along its old creases and placed it back in its wax envelope and set it down on the floor beside the logbook. She sat very still for a long moment. The light from the tall windows had shifted while she was reading. It was lower now, more golden. The rectangles on the floor had stretched out toward the walls, and the shadows in the corners of the room had grown deeper. The air was cold. Her breath made small clouds that hung in front of her face for a moment before dissolving. She reached out and picked up the tin box. The lid was pressed on tight. It took her a moment to work it loose. The metal had corroded slightly where the lid met the base, and she had to use her fingernails to pry it open. Inside the tin in bundles held with crumbling paper bands were old large format banknotes from the 1940s and 1950s, the kind of bills that had not been printed in decades. They were worn soft with handling but still intact, still legal tender. Willa counted them slowly. $4,280, a lifetime of savings, a portion of every paycheck drawn over 26 years. Hidden in a tin box in a secret compartment because a man did not trust banks after the failure of the Cairo Trust. Beneath the bills wrapped in soft cloth was something else. Willa lifted it out. It was a brass pilot's whistle on a faded yellow lanyard. The whistle was identical in make to the one her grandfather had carried for 31 years. The one her father had worn around his neck. The one she now carried in the chest pocket of her chore coat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her own whistle. She held them both in her hands, 2 brass whistles. One that had belonged to her grandfather, Harlan Jessup. One that had belonged to Calvin Mosley. 2 men who had known each other, who had shared coffee in the early morning dark on the deck of this landing office, who had worked the same river and respected each other in the way that men who work hard respect other men who work hard. And now both whistles were here, in her hands, in this room that had waited 65 years for someone to come and open the cabinet and find what had been left behind. Willa did not cry. Her throat was tight, but she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that a river person keeps her water inside her own banks. But she did speak. She spoke aloud to the empty room and to the cold pot-bellied stove and to the logbook on the floor and to whoever might be listening. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Mosley. I will make a pot of coffee on your stove tomorrow morning." Her voice sounded strange in the empty room, small, but clear. It echoed off the walls and the ceiling and came back to her, changed the way sounds do in places that have been quiet for a long time. She sat there on the floor until the light from the windows faded from gold to gray to the soft blue of early evening. Then she got up and found the back room that Cleon had mentioned. There was a cot there, a frame of rusted iron with a canvas stretched across it. She laid out her sleeping bag and used her duffel bag as a pillow and lay down in the dark. She could hear the river through the walls, the soft, constant whisper of water moving past, the occasional cry of a night bird, the creak of the old building settling into itself the way old buildings do when the temperature drops. She kept both brass whistles in the chest pocket of her chore coat. The weight of them against her ribs was different now, heavier, but not in a bad way, in the way that something is heavier when it carries more meaning than it did before. She fell asleep listening to the river, and she dreamed of fog and towboats and a man she had never met pouring coffee in the dark before sunrise. The rebuilding took patient months. Willa did not spend Calvin Mosley's money recklessly. She understood what that money represented. 26 years of work. 26 years of small savings. A portion of every paycheck set aside by a man who had learned during the bank failures of the Depression that the only money you could trust was the money you could hold in your hands. She kept most of it in a credit union account in Cairo. She spent it in small, careful amounts, only on things that were necessary, only on things that Calvin Mosley would have understood. The roof over the back porch had to be reframed before the spring rains came. The cedar beams had rotted where the shingles had failed and water had been getting in for years. Willa bought lumber from a mill in Paducah and carried it up the gravel road in loads on her back when she could not afford delivery. The two tall river windows had to be reglazed. The old glass was cracked in places and the putty had dried and fallen away. Willa learned to cut glass and set it in frames. She made mistakes. She broke panes. She cut her fingers. But she learned. The pot-bellied stove needed its flue cleaned. 65 years of soot and debris had built up in the stovepipe. Willa climbed onto the roof with a brush she had made from wire and old rags, and she cleaned the flue inch by inch until she could see daylight through the top. The well behind the building proved sound when Doreen Fitch brought a county inspector out. The inspector was a heavy man in his 60s who looked at Willa with the skeptical eyes of someone who had seen too many young people give up on hard things. But he tested the water and checked the casing and said it was clean. With a new hand pump, it gave cold, clear water that tasted faintly of sand and limestone. Willa installed the pump herself. She followed instructions from an old manual she found at the county library. It took her 3 days and she had to redo it twice. But when she finally pumped the handle and clear water came rushing out into the bucket she had set beneath the spout, she laughed out loud for the first time in months. She took the leather-bound logbook to a river history archivist in Dubuque. His name was Henry Linwood. He was a man in his 70s with white hair and thick glasses, and the gentle, distracted manner of someone who had spent his life surrounded by old books and old papers. He held the logbook in his hands the way you hold something precious, something fragile, something that cannot be replaced. He told Willa the logbook was worth over $14,000 to the right collector. Willa did not sell it. She licensed photographic reproductions of 3 pages to the River History Museum for $2,000. The pages showed typical entries from the summer of 1957. Boat names and pilot names and cargo lists and weather reports. The museum wanted them for an exhibit about the old river landings of the lower Ohio. But the pages with her grandfather's 17 visits she kept entirely for herself. Those pages were not for sale. Those pages were not for display. Those pages were hers. The record of Harlan Jessup coming and going from this place that was now her place. The proof that she was not the first of her family to stand on this bluff and look out at the brown water and feel something settle in her chest. The people of Pulaski County began to notice her. Word travels in small places. It moves through church halls and feed stores and the checkout lines at the grocery. It moves through the mouths of people who have known each other for generations and who pay attention to anything new because new things are rare in places where most things stay the same. A young woman had bought the old Olmsted Landing office. She was living out there alone. She was fixing it up. She had river people in her family. Her grandfather had been a pilot on the lower Ohio back in the old days. Doreen Fitch came by every Wednesday with a thermos of coffee and the township newsletter. She would sit with Willa on the front porch if the weather was good, or at the pilot's desk if it was not. She did not ask many questions. She just visited, just checked in, just let Willa know that someone was paying attention. Cleon came by with a load of split cottonwood and sycamore in the green pickup truck. He stacked the wood under the back eave without being asked and refused to take any money for it. "You will need that for the winter," he said. "That stove eats wood like a hungry man eats biscuits." Then he drove away before Willa could argue. A retired carpenter from the next bluff over came out one Saturday with his own tools in the back of his truck. His name was Otho Pruitt. He was in his 70s with hands the color of old leather and eyes that had seen more than they would ever say. He had heard from Doreen that a young woman was reopening the Olmsted Landing. He had some time on his hands. He thought he might be useful. He showed Willa how to reframe the back porch roof. He showed her how to sister a rotted beam, how to cut rafters to the proper angle, how to lay sheathing and felt paper and shingles in the right order so the water would run off instead of in. He did not talk much while he worked. He just set up his sawhorses in the gravel turnaround and worked until the light failed. Then he packed his tools into his truck and drove home in an old Ford with one headlight that was always brighter than the other. He came back 3 Saturdays in a row. He refused to let Willa pay him. "This is river work," he said. "River people help river people. That is how it has always been." Willa did not know how to respond to that. She had been alone for so long. She had been carrying her own weight for so long. She had forgotten that there were people in the world who helped other people without expecting anything in return. But she was learning. In late February, a man drove up the gravel road in a truck that Willa did not recognize. He was in his 70s, a big man with broad shoulders and a face that had been weathered by years of sun and wind and river spray. He moved slowly the way old men move when their bodies have started to fail them, but their spirits have not. His name was Carver Neely. He had been a deckhand with Ingram Marine Service in the 1970s. He had worked the lower Ohio for 15 years, pushing barges through the locks and the long, quiet reaches that only towboat men ever see. He had known Willa's father. Carver stood in the gravel turnaround with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and looked at the landing office for a long moment before he spoke. "I heard about what you were doing out here," he said. His voice was rough, worn down by years of shouting over engine noise and wind. "Heard from Doreen Fitch. She said you were Emmett Jessup's girl." "Yes, sir," Willa said. Carver nodded slowly. He looked at the building, at the new shingles on the back porch roof, at the reglazed windows catching the winter light. "I brought you something," he said. He walked to the back of his truck and lowered the tailgate. Inside was a wooden crate filled with old things, river things. Fare cards from the 1960s and 1970s. A brass towboat lantern with a cracked glass lens. A section of original dock timber from a landing that had been torn down decades ago. A coil of manila rope that had been used to tie off barges. A framed photograph of a towboat crew standing on the deck of a boat called the Miss Sarah in 1973. "These belong here more than they belong with me," Carver said. He did not look at Willa when he said it. He looked at the river below the bluff, at the brown water moving past, the way it had been moving for thousands of years, before any of them were born. He helped Willa carry the crate inside. He set it down by the pot-bellied stove and stood there, looking around the room, looking at the pilot's desk and the tall windows and the faded green wainscoting. Then he told her about her father. "I remember Emmett Jessup," he said. "Your father was a good man. On the boats, when the coffee was running low at the end of a long shift, he would give his share to the younger men, the green ones who were still learning. He said coffee helped a young man stay sharp, better than it helped an old man stay awake." Willa stood very still. She had not heard anyone talk about her father, as if he were a real person in 6 years. She had not heard anyone share a memory of him. She had not heard his name spoken by someone who had known him. "Your father understood something that a lot of men never figure out," Carver said. "He understood that kindness is not weakness, that helping someone else does not take anything away from you. It adds to you. It makes you more than you were before." He looked at Willa for the first time since he had started talking. His eyes were wet. "I was sorry when I heard what happened to him," he said. "The river takes good men sometimes. It does not care that they are good. It just takes them. All we can do is remember them." Then Carver Neely walked out of the landing office and climbed into his truck and drove away down the gravel road. Willa stood in the doorway and watched him go. She watched until the truck disappeared around the bend and the sound of the engine faded into the trees, and there was nothing left but the silence and the river and the cold February air. Then she went inside and sat down at the pilot's desk and looked at the wooden crate full of river things that Carver Neely had brought her. And for the first time in 6 years, she let herself remember her father, not as a name in a Coast Guard report, not as a loss that she carried in her chest, but as a man, a real man, who had lived and worked and laughed and given his coffee to younger men on cold mornings, because he understood that kindness was not weakness. She sat at the pilot's desk until the light faded and the room grew dark around her. And she did not feel alone. Pearl Dunaway drove down from Mound City in the second month. She came in a car loaded with boxes. Willa's things from the storage room at the laundromat, clothes and books and the green metal coffee tin with the savings that Willa had forgotten to take with her, and a wooden box of old fare cards that had belonged to Pearl's late husband, Ezra. These were Ezra's, Pearl said, from his years in the engine rooms. He would want you to have them. Pearl stayed for 3 days. She slept on a folding cot in the back room. She helped Willa rehang the wooden shutters that had been hanging crooked on their rusted hinges. She showed Willa how to bank a coal fire in the pot-bellied stove so it would last through the night without going out, the way Ezra had banked fires in the engine rooms of the Lower Ohio towboats when he was working the overnight shifts. "You build the fire hot first," Pearl said. "Then you cover it with ash. The ash holds the heat in, slows everything down. The coals stay alive under there all night. In the morning, you rake back the ash and add fresh fuel and the fire comes right back." Willa watched and learned. She had so much to learn. She had grown up in river country, but she had never lived on her own. She had never heated a building with a wood stove. She had never pumped her own water or fixed her own roof, or lived miles from the nearest neighbor. But she was learning. On the morning Pearl left, she stood beside her car in the gravel turnaround, with the early spring sunlight falling across her iron-gray hair. Harlan would be proud, she said. Emmett would be proud. You are a Jessup in the only way that matters. Willa did not know what to say. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Pearl reached out and took her hand. "The river is in your blood," Pearl said. "It has been in your family for 3 generations. You cannot run from that. You cannot hide from it. All you can do is find a way to live with it. And that is what you are doing here. That is what this place is for. It is where you learn to live with the river inside you." Then Pearl Dunaway got into her car and drove away down the gravel road, and Willa stood alone in the clearing and watched until the car was gone. She sat down on the front step of the landing office. The morning was quiet. The river whispered below the bluff. A crow called out somewhere in the trees. The sun was warm on her face for the first time in months. And Willa Jessup cried. She cried for the first time since her father died on the river, 6 years before. The tears came up out of her like the river itself, slow and brown and patient. They rolled down her cheeks and dripped off her chin and fell onto the worn wooden boards of the porch. She cried for her mother who had died of pneumonia when she was 8 years old. She cried for her father who had died on a tow line near the New Madrid Bend when she was 14. She cried for her grandfather Harlan, who had worked the river for 31 years and who had landed at this very spot 17 times and who had brought pecans for the office. She cried for Calvin Mosley, who had made coffee at 4 in the morning for 26 years for men he was not required to serve. She cried for Aunt Coralie, who had brushed her hair at the kitchen table and who had folded her clothes into a duffel bag with the careful creases of 40 years of housework. She cried for everything she had lost and everything she had found and everything she did not yet understand. When the crying was finished, she felt washed. She felt clean. She felt like something that had been held inside her for a very long time had finally been released. Like water that had been pressing against a dam had finally found a way through. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her chore coat and stood up and went inside and made a pot of coffee on the pot-bellied stove. It was not 4 in the morning. It was almost noon. But she made the coffee anyway. Because Calvin Mosley had asked her to. Because some promises are not about time. They are about faith. By April, the back porch roof was tight. By May, the river windows held new glass. By June, the pot-bellied stove was working, and the front room had a swept pine floor and a fresh coat of pale gray-green paint on the wainscoting that matched what Willa could remember of the original color from the layers underneath. She had made a small bedroom for herself in the back room, the iron cot with a wool blanket and a kerosene lantern on a wooden crate beside it. Her father's old wooden toolbox that she had retrieved from Aunt Coralie's house sat in the corner. On top of it, she had set the frame photograph of Emmett Jessup in his Ingram Marine jacket. The photograph had been taken in 1995, the year after Willa was born. Her father was young in the picture, smiling, standing on the deck of a towboat with the river behind him. The landing office was becoming a home, not just a building, not just a place to sleep. A home. The kind of place where you know every creak of the floorboards and every shadow on the walls. The kind of place that knows you back. Willa started making coffee on the pot-bellied stove every morning at 4 o'clock. Not because anyone was coming. No one was coming. The boats had stopped landing at Olmsted in 1958. The dock had collapsed. The river had moved on. She made the coffee because Calvin Mosley had asked her to. In a letter he wrote 65 years ago, in a building that was now hers. A thing a man asks of you in a letter he wrote 65 years ago, in a building that is now yours, is a thing you do not refuse. She would set the kettle on the stove in the cold blue dark before sunrise. She would pour herself a cup at 4:30. She would sit at the roll-top pilot's desk and watch the slow brown river move past the bluff in the gray light. Some mornings, a single towboat would come up out of the fog 2 miles downstream on its way to the locks at Smithland. She would hear the low rumble of its engines first. Then she would see the navigation lights moving through the mist. Then the shape of the boat itself would emerge, like something being born out of the darkness. On those mornings, she would lift her grandfather's brass whistle out of her chest pocket and Calvin's whistle off the desk where she kept it, and she would hold both of them in her hand. 2 whistles. 2 men. 2 lives that had touched this place before she was born. She would hold them and listen to the low, far diesel of the boat moving against the current. And she would feel connected to something larger than herself, something that stretched back through the years, something that the river remembered even if no one else did. The river forgets nothing. The room does not either. And Willa Jessup, sitting at a roll-top desk in the cold blue dark with 2 brass whistles warm in her hand, did not forget either. By the end of that first summer, the landing office had become a place where people came on purpose. Word had spread through the river history community, the way word spreads through any small world of people who care about the same things. There was a young woman living at the old Olmsted Landing. She had the daily logbook from 1956 and 1957. She had found Calvin Mosley's letters. She was restoring the building. She made coffee on the original pot-bellied stove. River historians from Paducah drove up the gravel road to see the logbook. They sat at the pilot's desk and turned the pages slowly and read the names of boats and men that they had only known from old photographs and faded records. Some of them recognized names: fathers, grandfathers, uncles who had worked the water in the years before the interstate highways, and the diesel trucks changed everything. A retired lockmaster from the Smithland Dam came out one afternoon with his wife. He had worked the Ohio River for 42 years. He had known men whose names were in that logbook. He sat at the pilot's desk for an hour reading entries and shaking his head and saying their names aloud like prayers. Tommy Birdsong, he said. I knew Tommy. He taught me how to read the current at the Shawneetown Bend. Died in 73. Heart attack in his wheelhouse. They said he had his hands on the controls when he went. His wife sat beside him and held his hand and did not say anything. A woman from the River Heritage Museum in Cape Girardeau drove up one Saturday with a photographer. She wanted to document the building for their archives. She took photographs of the exterior and the interior, and the pot-bellied stove, and the pilot's desk, and the tall river windows with their new glass catching the summer light. She asked Willa if she would consider donating the logbook to the museum when she was finished with it. Willa said no. She said it politely but firmly. The logbook was not leaving this building. It belonged here. It had been written here. The men whose names were recorded in its pages had climbed these steps and walked through that door and stood at that desk. The logbook was part of this place the way the walls were part of this place, the way the floor was part of this place, the way the river below the bluff was part of this place. The woman from the museum nodded slowly. She understood. Some things belonged where they were. Some things could not be moved without losing something essential about what they were. She asked if the museum could send researchers to study the logbook on site. Willa said yes. That was different. That was sharing. That was letting other people connect with something that mattered. That was what Calvin Mosley would have wanted. He had written his letter for whoever came through the door next. He had left his savings and his whistle and his logbook for a stranger he would never meet. He had believed that some things were meant to be passed on, that some things grew more valuable when they were shared. On a clear morning in late September, a car Willa did not recognize came up the gravel road and parked in the turnaround. The man who got out was old. He moved slowly the way very old men move, each step deliberate, each motion careful and considered. He used a wooden cane with a brass handle that had been worn smooth by years of gripping. His hair was white and thin and combed straight back from a face that had been weathered by 8 decades of living. He stood beside his car for a long moment looking at the landing office. Willa came out onto the porch to meet him. The old man looked up at her. His eyes were pale blue, watery with age, but still sharp, still seeing. My name is Vernon Blakely, he said. I drove 4 hours from Indianapolis to find this place. I heard you have the Olmsted logbook from 56 and 57. Willa nodded. I was hoping, the old man said. His voice caught for a moment. He cleared his throat and tried again. I was hoping you might look up a date for me. August 12th, 1957. Come inside, Willa said. She led him into the landing office. She helped him up the single step onto the porch and through the door and across the wide pine floor to the pilot's desk. She pulled out the high stool for him, but he shook his head. He wanted to stand. Willa took the logbook down from the shelf where she kept it. She opened it on the desk and turned the pages carefully until she found August 1957. She ran her finger down the entries until she found the 12th. The entry said, Vernon Blakely Towboat. River Queen cargo grain arrived 5:47 a.m., departed 8:15 a.m. river. Stage 14.2 feet weather clear. And below it, in Calvin Mosley's careful handwriting, was a note in the margin. First crossing alone for this young man. Gave him an extra cup of coffee. Vernon Blakely read the entry 3 times. Then he began to cry. He stood there in the doorway of the pilot's desk, with his hands gripping the edge of the oak roll top and tears running down the weathered creases of his face. He did not make a sound. He just stood there and let the tears come. Willa did not say anything. She did not try to comfort him. She understood that some tears are not meant to be stopped. Some tears have been waiting a long time to fall. That was my first solo run, Vernon said when he could speak again. His voice was rough, broken. I was 23 years old, scared half to death. I had trained for 2 years. But when you are alone in that wheelhouse for the first time, with a string of barges behind you, and the current pushing against you, and nobody to ask if you are doing it right. He shook his head. I remember pulling into Olmsted that morning. I remember the fog lifting as I came around the bend. I remember seeing the landing office up on the bluff with a light in the window. He touched the page with one trembling finger. Calvin Mosley came down to the dock to take my line, he said. I was so nervous I nearly threw it into the water. He just laughed and caught it and tied me off like it was nothing, like he had done it 1,000 times, which I suppose he had. Vernon looked up at Willa. He brought me up here to this office, he said, sat me down at this desk, poured me a cup of coffee from that stove over there. He said to me, Vernon paused. His voice broke again. He said to me that every pilot who ever worked the river had a first solo run. He said the fear never goes away completely. You just learn to work with it. You learn to let it make you careful, instead of letting it make you freeze. Vernon shook his head slowly. I never forgot that he said. 40 years I worked the river after that morning. 40 years I stood in wheelhouses and pushed barges through locks and crossings and bends that would scare the paint off a younger man. And every time I felt that fear start to rise up in me, I remembered what Calvin Mosley told me in this office on August 12th, 1957. He looked around the room, at the faded green wainscoting, at the tall river windows, at the pot-bellied stove in the corner. I thought this place was gone, he said. I thought they tore it down years ago. When I heard someone was living here, when I heard about the logbook. He shook his head. I had to come. I had to see it one more time before I die. Willa made him coffee on the pot-bellied stove. She used the same kettle that Calvin Mosley had used. She poured the water into the same kind of enamel pot. She set it on the same iron plate that had held coffee pots for 26 years. She brought Vernon Blakely a cup, and he held it in both hands and breathed in the steam and closed his eyes. They sat together at the pilot's desk for 2 hours. Vernon told her stories about the river, about the men he had worked with, about the boats he had piloted, about the storms and the floods and the low-water years when the sandbars shifted and you had to relearn every crossing you thought you knew. He told her about his wife who had waited for him at home for 40 years, who had raised their children while he was on the water, who had understood that the river was in his blood and that he could not be happy away from it. She passed 3 years ago, Vernon said. Lung cancer. She never smoked a day in her life. Sometimes the river is not the only thing that takes people before their time. He told her about his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, about the family reunions where he was the oldest one there, and everyone wanted to hear his stories about the old days on the river. They think I am making it up, he said. They think I am exaggerating. They did not grow up with the river the way we did. They do not understand what it was like. The fog at 4 in the morning, the sound of the engines in the dark, the way the water looked when the sun came up over the far bank and turned everything gold. He looked at Willa. But you understand, he said. I can see it in your eyes. You have the river in you. The same way I do. The same way Calvin Mosley did. The same way your grandfather Harlan did. How do you know about my grandfather? Willa asked. Vernon smiled. It was a tired smile. The smile of a man who had lived long enough to see patterns that younger people could not see yet. I looked you up before I came, he said. Talked to some people. The river community is small. Everyone knows everyone or knows someone who knows them. When I heard that Harlan Jessup's granddaughter was living at the Olmsted Landing, he shook his head. It made sense. It made perfect sense. This is where you were supposed to end up. This is where the river wanted you to be. When Vernon Blakely left that afternoon, Willa walked him to his car. He moved even more slowly than he had when he arrived. The 2 hours of sitting and talking had stiffened his joints, but his eyes were brighter. His face was more peaceful. Thank you, he said. He did not say what he was thanking her for. He did not have to. Willa watched him drive away down the gravel road. She watched until the car disappeared around the bend and the sound of the engine faded into the trees. And there was nothing left but the silence and the river and the late afternoon light falling golden across the bluff. She went back inside and sat down at the pilot's desk and looked at the logbook still open to August 12th, 1957. First, crossing alone for this young man. Gave him an extra cup of coffee. Calvin Mosley had written those words 68 years ago. He had not known that the young man he gave an extra cup of coffee would remember it for the rest of his life. He had not known that the young man would become an old man and drive 4 hours to see those words again before he died. He had just done a small kindness on a cold morning, and the small kindness had lasted. That was the lesson Willa was learning in the landing office on the bluff above the Mississippi. Small kindnesses last. They outlive the people who do them. They echo forward through the years and touch people who were not even born when the kindness was first extended. Calvin Mosley had been dead for decades, but his kindness was still alive. It was alive in the logbook. It was alive in the letter. It was alive in Vernon Blakely's memory. It was alive in the coffee that Willa made on the pot-bellied stove every morning at 4 o'clock. The river forgets nothing. The room does not either, and neither do the people who pass through. In March of Willa's second year at the landing office, an envelope arrived in her mailbox at the township office. The envelope had no return address. Willa opened it standing at the counter in Doreen Fitch's office, with the spring sunlight coming through the window behind her. Inside the envelope was a framed document. It was her grandfather's pilot's license from 1961. The certificate that Harlan Jessup had walked 7 blocks home from the federal building in Paducah to hang on the kitchen wall above the bread box. The certificate that had hung there for the rest of his life. On the back of the frame, in careful handwriting that Willa recognized, was a single line. He would have wanted you to have this. The handwriting was Aunt Coralie's. Willa stood there holding the frame for a long moment. She had not spoken to Aunt Coralie since the night she found her duffel bag on the porch. She had not written. She had not called. She had not known what to say. But Aunt Coralie had kept the pilot's license. She had saved it. She had waited. And now she had sent it to Willa without explanation, without apology, without asking for anything in return. Just, he would have wanted you to have this. Willa drove back to the landing office with the frame on the seat beside her. She hung it on the wall next to Calvin Mosley's letter. 2 documents side by side. Her grandfather's pilot's license and the letter from a man he had known. 2 pieces of paper that connected the past to the present. 2 testaments to lives lived on the river. Willa stood back and looked at them, and she understood something that she had not understood before. She understood why Aunt Coralie had put her duffel bag on the porch that November night. She understood the fear behind it, the desperation, the terrible arithmetic of a 63-year-old widow who had just remarried and who was terrified of being alone again. Aunt Coralie had not pushed Willa out because she did not love her. She had pushed Willa out because she was afraid. Afraid of losing Grover. Afraid of the silence of an empty house. Afraid of the years stretching out ahead of her with no one to share them. Sometimes people do the unkind thing not because they have stopped being afraid, but because they have not. Willa thought about her mother who had been afraid of leaving her daughter behind, who had held on as long as she could before the pneumonia took her. She thought about her father who had been afraid of every cold, dark crossing of the New Madrid Bend, who had gone out onto the deck anyway because that was his job, because that was who he was. She thought about Calvin Mosley, who had been afraid of what would happen to his life's work when the landing closed, who had hidden his savings and his whistle and his logbook in a secret compartment because he was afraid that no one would come, that no one would find them, that everything he had built would be forgotten. Everyone was afraid of something. The question was not whether you were afraid. The question was what you did with the fear, whether you let it make you small, or whether you found a way to move forward anyway. Willa did not call Aunt Coralie. She did not write her a letter. But she forgave her. Standing there in the landing office with her grandfather's pilot's license on the wall, beside Calvin Mosley's letter, she forgave her aunt for being human, for being afraid, for doing the best she could with the fear she had. That was enough. That was all any of them could do. The seasons turned. Spring came to the bluff above the Mississippi, with dogwood blooms and the smell of river mud warming in the sun. Summer brought thunderstorms that rolled up the valley and shook the old building to its bones. Autumn painted the trees along the far bank in colors that Willa had no names for. Winter settled in with ice on the water's edge and frost on the windows and the pot-bellied stove, burning day and night to keep the cold at bay. Willa made coffee every morning at 4 o'clock. She sat at the pilot's desk and watched the river in the gray light before sunrise. She held the 2 brass whistles in her hand and listened for the distant sound of towboat engines moving through the darkness. Sometimes a boat would pass. She would see its lights first, then the shape of it emerging from the fog, then the long string of barges pushing against the current. The boats did not stop at Olmsted anymore. They had not stopped since 1958. But they still passed by. They still moved up and down the river the way boats had moved for 150 years. Willa would watch them go, and she would think about her grandfather standing in wheelhouses just like those. She would think about her father working the decks. She would think about Calvin Mosley, watching from this very window as the boats came and went in the early morning dark. The river forgets nothing. She understood that now. She understood it in her bones. The river remembered every boat that had ever traveled its waters, every pilot who had ever stood at the wheel, every deckhand who had ever thrown a line, every landing office man who had ever made coffee at 4 in the morning for men who were cold and tired and far from home. The river remembered Harlan Jessup landing at Olmsted 17 times with pecans for the office. The river remembered Emmett Jessup giving his coffee to younger men on cold mornings. The river remembered Calvin Mosley pouring an extra cup for a scared young pilot on his first solo run. And now the river would remember Willa Jessup, the girl who had bought a landing office for $1, the girl who had found a secret compartment that had not been opened in 65 years, the girl who had made coffee on the pot-bellied stove every morning at 4 o'clock, because a dead man had asked her to in a letter he wrote before she was born. She was part of the river now. She was part of its memory. One evening in late October of her second year at the landing office, Willa sat on the front step and watched the sunset over the Mississippi. The light was extraordinary. It came in low and golden across the water and set the trees along the far bank on fire. The river itself seemed to glow, brown and gold and orange and red, the colors of autumn reflected in the slow-moving current. Willa sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and the brass whistle warm against her ribs, and she watched the light change. She thought about the people who had helped her get here. Pearl Dunaway, who had given her a place to sleep when she had nowhere else to go. Who had told her about Olmsted and Calvin Mosley. Who had driven down to help her rehang the shutters and bank the fire. Doreen and Cleon Fitch, who had welcomed her to Pulaski County. Who had brought her wood for the winter and checked on her every few days to make sure she was still alive. Otho Pruitt, who had taught her how to fix a roof, who had come back 3 Saturdays in a row and refused to take any money. Carver Neely, who had brought her a box of river things and told her stories about her father. Vernon Blakely, who had driven 4 hours to see his name in a logbook and who had cried in the doorway of the pilot's desk. And Aunt Coralie, who had brushed her hair at the kitchen table when she was 9 years old, who had made red-eye gravy on Sunday mornings, who had folded her clothes into a duffel bag with the careful creases of 40 years of housework, who had sent her grandfather's pilot's license without a word of explanation, because she knew that some things do not need to be explained. All of these people had given her something, not money, not things, something more valuable than money or things. They had given her the knowledge that she was not alone, that she was part of something larger than herself, that the river connected her to everyone who had ever worked it and loved it and been changed by it. That was what Calvin Mosley had been trying to tell her in his letter. A landing office is not just a building. A landing office is a room that remembers, a room that holds the memory of every boat that ever tied up to its dock, every pilot who ever climbed its steps, every cup of coffee ever poured, every small kindness ever extended. The room does not forget, and neither do the people who are touched by it. Willa looked out at the river. The sun had dropped below the tree line now, and the colors were fading from the water. The gold was becoming bronze. The bronze was becoming gray. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. She thought about the question that people sometimes asked her when they came to visit the landing office. The river historians and the retired pilots and the families of men whose names were in the logbook. They asked her, "Did the room find you? Or did you find the room?" For a long time, she had not known how to answer that question. But sitting here now in the fading light with the river moving past below and the stars coming out above, she understood. The answer was both. The answer was always both. She had been moving toward this place her whole life without knowing it. The river had been pulling her. Her grandfather's memory had been pulling her. Her father's death had been pulling her. Every loss she had suffered and every lesson she had learned had been pulling her toward this bluff above the Mississippi, where an old landing office had been waiting for 65 years. But the room had been waiting too. It had been waiting for someone to come. Someone who would understand what it was. Someone who would care for it. Someone who would make coffee on the pot-bellied stove at 4 a.m. and keep the memory alive. Calvin Mosley had known that someone would come. He had written his letter to whoever finds this. He had not known who it would be. He had not known when they would arrive. But he had believed that they would come, that the room would call to them the way the river calls to everyone who has the river in their blood. And he had been right. Willa had come. She had found the letter and the logbook and the whistle and the money. She had restored the building. She had welcomed the visitors. She had made the coffee. She had become the keeper of the room. And in becoming the keeper of the room, she had found something she had not known she was looking for. She had found a home. Not just a place to live. A home. The kind of place where you belong. The kind of place that belongs to you. The kind of place where your history and your present and your future all come together into something that makes sense. For some people, that place is where they were born. A family farm. A hometown. A profession their parents handed them. For others, it is a place they have to find. A houseboat on a Louisiana bayou. A ranger station 14 miles from the nearest road. A chapel in the woods of upstate New York. A post office in a dying town in Iowa. A landing office on a low bluff above the lower Ohio River, where it bends to meet the Mississippi. The form does not matter. What matters is whether you can stand inside it and look around and feel something settle in your chest. Something that says this. This is the room that has been waiting. This is where I begin. Willa Jessup stood up from the front step of the landing office. The last light was gone from the river now. The water was dark. The stars were bright. The air was cold with the first hint of the winter that was coming. She went inside and closed the door behind her. She lit the kerosene lantern on the pilot's desk. She added wood to the pot-bellied stove. She sat down at the desk and opened the logbook to a random page and read the names of boats and men who had passed through this place decades before she was born. Tomorrow morning she would wake at 3:30. She would get dressed in the dark. She would walk to the front room. She would build up the fire in the stove and set the kettle on the iron plate. At 4 o'clock she would pour herself a cup of coffee. She would sit at the pilot's desk and watch the river in the gray light before sunrise. She would hold the 2 brass whistles in her hand. One that had belonged to her grandfather, Harlan Jessup. One that had belonged to Calvin Mosley. And she would wait for the boats. They would not stop. They had not stopped at Olmsted in 67 years. But they would pass by. They would move up and down the river in the darkness the way they had always moved. The way they would always move. And Willa would be there to see them. She would be there to remember, because that was her job now. That was what she had been called to do. To keep the room. To tend the memory. To make the coffee at 4 in the morning for men who would never come through the door, but whose spirits still moved on the water. The river forgets nothing. The room does not either. And Willa Jessup sitting at a roll-top desk with a kerosene lantern burning and a pot-bellied stove glowing. And 2 brass whistles pressed against her heart did not forget either. She was 22 years old now. She had been kicked out of her aunt's house with a duffel bag and $1 to her name. She had bought an old riverboat landing office on the Mississippi River bluffs of southern Illinois. It was the best dollar she ever spent. And this was just the beginning.